Chapter 17 of J.S. Bach by Albert Schweitzer, translated by Ernest Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed by Jonathan Schofield. Chamber and orchestral works. Bach seems to have cultivated violin playing from childhood. When he left the gymnasium at Lüneburg, he was an accomplished violinist, and could take a place as such in the orchestra of Johann Ernst, the brother of the reigning Duke of Weimar. Nor did he neglect the stringed instruments in later life. In chamber music he played by preference the viola, for in this way he found himself as it were in the centre of the web of tone. We have no direct information as to the extent of his proficiency on these instruments. We may be sure, however, that he had a thorough practical knowledge of the technique of the stringed instruments. Otherwise it would have been impossible for him to take such unique advantage of all the effects that can be obtained on them, as he does in the polyphonic works of violin, gamba, and cello solo. Nor can he quite forget that he is a violinist in the works written for keyed instruments. The violinist is observable on every page. The characteristic of Bach's piano and organ style is precisely this, that he demands from the keyed instruments the same aptitudes for phrasing and modulation as the strings. At bottom he conceived everything for an ideal instrument, that had all the keyed instruments' possibilities of polyphonic playing and all the bowed instruments' capacities for phrasing. This is how he came to write polyphonically even for a single instrument. Polyphonic playing on the violin had long been customary in Germany. Bruns (1666 1697) of Husum, Buxtehude's pupil, used to perform in this way, at the same time playing the bass on the organ pedals. The Italians were far behind the Northerners in this art. Although Bach wrote in reality 3 partitas, suites, and 3 sonatas, it is customary to speak, for brevity's sake, of his 6 sonatas for solo violin. As might be guessed from our knowledge of his way of composing, these works were written within a short time of each other. They belong to the Khotan epoch. The oldest autograph we have of them probably dates from about 1720. The history of this autograph is told by Polkau, the gallant manuscript hunter of the early days of Bach enthusiasm. In a short note on the front page of it: "I found this excellent work, in Bach's own handwriting, in Petersburg in 1814, among a lot of old papers, destined for the butter shop that had belonged to Palskow, the pianist. At a later date it passed, with the other manuscript treasures of the finder, into the possession of the Berlin Royal Library. Polkau was in error, however, in imagining it to be an autograph of Bach's. It is from the hand of Anna Magdalena, whose handwriting even at that time was deceptively like that of her husband. While she was making the copy she was watching over one of the boys, perhaps Friedemann, who used a free page for exercises of his own in making notes, his father having written some examples for him. There are no blank sheets, for the leaves are filled on the same principles as the English autograph of the second part of the Well-Tempered Clavichord. In order to avoid the necessity of turning over, each work is made to occupy one or other side of a page only. In the Leipzig period Anna Magdalena made a new copy of the sonatas for solo violin. She made them up in one volume with those for violoncello, with the title Pars 1, Violino Solo senza basso, composte par Signor Johann Sebastian Bach, Pars 2, Violoncello Solo senza basso, composé par Signor J.S. Bach, maître de la chapelle et directeur de la musique à Leipzig, écrite par Madame Bachen, son épouse. Bach, it will be observed, is not called court composer. The copy must therefore be dated earlier than 1736. The sonatas for solo violin were first printed in 1802 by Simrock of Bonn. In 1854 Robert Schumann edited them for Breitkopf and Hartel, adding a pianoforte accompaniment to them. This was following in the footsteps of Mendelssohn, who had adopted the same procedure in 1847 with the chaconne from the second partita. To us it is incomprehensible that 2 such great artists could believe that they were thus carrying out Bach's intentions. The sonatas and partitas are so arranged that each sonata is followed by a partita. In both of them we hardly know what to admire most, the richness of the invention or the daring of the polyphony that is given to the violin. The more we read, hear, and play them, the greater our astonishment becomes. The chaconne that concludes the second partita has always been regarded as the classical piece for solo violin, and justly, since both the theme and its development are consummately adapted to the genius of the instrument. Out of a single theme Bach conjures up a whole world. We seem to hear sorrow contending with pain, till at last they blend in a mood of profound resignation. It is very instructive to compare the chaconne with the passacaglia for organ, which is also in reality a chaconne. For the organ, Bach takes a theme that is accented only on the strong beats of the bar, knowing well that the least syncopation would give the whole work a restlessness that would make it unbearable on the organ. On the violin, however, that permits of every kind of accent, cross accentuation makes for superior force and vivacity. He therefore employs here a quite unusual amount of syncopation. The instrument, free from the hindrance of an accompaniment, shall for once realize all its powers in perfect unrestraint. It is interesting to note at the two themes side by side that between them incarnate the organ and the violin music of Bach. Chaconne for violin. Passacaglia for organ. Notice how in the chaconne Bach alternates between polyphonic and monophonic writing, so as to give the hearer relief, and to heighten the effect of the polyphony by the monophony interspersed among it. His music as a whole is full of these fine calculations of effect. Every one who has heard these sonatas must have realized how sadly this material enjoyment of them falls below his ideal enjoyment. There are many passages in them that the best player cannot render without a certain harshness. The arpeggio harmonies sometimes make a particularly bad effect even in the finest playing. Polyphonic arpeggio playing is and must be an impossibility. There is thus some justification for the question whether Bach in these sonatas has not overstepped the bounds of artistic possibility. If it be so, he has for once acted against his own principles, for everywhere else he has been careful to set an instrument only such tasks as it can solve with satisfaction to the ear. Recent research seems to show that the tradition of Bach's own day can throw some light on this. In an interesting article by Arnold Schering, one of the most assiduous of Bach's students of our time, some passages from old works are cited that make it probable that the old arched bow with which the tension was effected not by means of a screw but by the pressure of the thumb was still in use in Germany in Bach's time. The flat, mechanically stretched Italian bow, the predecessor of that of today, was indeed known in Germany from the beginning of the 18th century, but displaced the older one very slowly. The German violinist of Bach's day could thus stretch the hairs tighter or relax them as he liked. Chords that the virtuosi of today can play only with difficulty and without any beauty of effect by throwing the bow back on the lower strings gave him no trouble at all. He simply loosened the hairs a little so that they curved over the strings. This accounts for the fact that the Germans cultivated polyphonic playing on the violin, while it was almost unknown to the Italians. In Italy, the straight bow with its purely mechanical tension had already established itself by the end of the 17th century. This bow permits a polyphonic playing only to a limited extent, since it allows of no further tension during the performance, for if the hairs are relaxed, they do not arch over the strings, but fall against the stick. With the old German bow, on the other hand, the stick of which was not straight, there was a fair space between the hairs and the bow. The last representative of chord playing on the violin was the Norwegian Ole Bull (1810 to 1880). His bridge was quite flat. He had his bows made in such a way that the stick stood at a considerable distance from the hairs. It is interesting to know that he always maintained that this method was no new invention of his own, but a return to the true violin method of the past. It is quite possible that in Scandinavia the traditions of the 17th century had been retained, along with the old bows, down to Ole Bull's time. In his sonatas for violin solo, Bach has thus demanded of the instrument nothing impossible or even unsatisfactory per se, but only what seems so with our excessively arched bridges and our flat Italian bows. To play these sonatas as he did, we need only to file down the archings of the bridge so as to bring the strings almost level, and to use a bow so shaped from nut to point that the hairs can curve towards the stick without touching it. Still better is a bow with a slightly curved stick. In this way violinists will be able once more to play Bach in a correct style. Any one who has heard the chords of the chaconne played without any restlessness and without arpeggios can no longer doubt that this is the only correct and, from the artistic standpoint, satisfactory way of playing it. Of course, the slackly stretched bow demands a different technique from the usual one. The pure springing bow is impossible. But the tone also undergoes a change. It acquires a curious softness. If we play the chords with the hairs of the bow relaxed, we get an almost organ-like tone, somewhat like that of a soft silicionale. To get an idea of this tone, unscrew the hairs of an ordinary bow, place the stick under the violin, lay the hairs over the strings, and fasten them again to the stick. If we move this reversed bow, we observe the organ-like ethereal tone that the relaxed bow produced. When we have imitated the old bow as best we can, and given the hairs their utmost tension by thumb pressure in the monophonic passages, we still do not get the powerful tone of the modern mechanically stretched bow. We purchased beauty of tone, that is to say, at the expense of some loss of strength. The reproach was always being levelled against Ole Bull that his tone was weak. It is a question whether the modern public would accustom itself to this weak tone. In large concert rooms it will scarcely be possible to play the sonatas for solo violin in the old way, as the tone would not carry sufficiently. In chamber music performances, on the other hand, the proper style of rendering should suit admirably. If we had once heard the chaconne in this way, we cannot afterwards endure it in any other. Thus the result would be that the works for solo violin would disappear from the programs of the larger concerts, and be restored to the chamber music to which they really belong. The movements of the sonatas for the solo violin that exist also for the piano or organ are arrangements of violin originals. It is doubtful whether they are all effective in this form. They show, however, how completely the violin method of phrasing ranked with Bach as the universal method to which the keyed instruments had to try to conform. When we read the prelude of the third partita, we find it impossible to believe that Bach could have entertained the idea of asking the organ to perform these repeated semiquavers, the proper articulation of which is possible only on a bowed instrument. Yet this is what he actually does in the instrumental prelude to the Ratswall cantata, Wir danken dir, Gott, wir danken dir, number 29. He could only venture to do so because he himself played the part on the Rückpositiv of the organ at St. Thomas's. The fugue of the first sonata may have been originally conceived for the organ. Its theme is derived from the first movement of the Veni Sancte Spiritus and runs thus. Mattheson quotes this theme in his Grosse Generalbassschule, and sketches a development of which resembles Bach's at many points, especially in the employment of a chromatic countersubject. As he quotes in the same place the theme of the great organ fugue in G minor without mentioning Bach's name, it may be taken for granted that he has also the fugue of the third sonata before him. Did Bach play it in Hamburg about 1720 as an organ fugue? Assuredly not in the present form, for the structure of the fugue, it reminds us of the chaconne, has nothing whatever in common with those for the organ, but is wholly designed for the violin. Here again, therefore, the violin form must be the original one. In two places Mattheson speaks of the fugue of a minor sonata with unreserved admiration. The six sonatas for violin solo also belong to the Cothen period. They are as perfect in their own way as the works for violin solo. Chord playing, of course, is not used to anything like the same extent, nor does Bach even employ a simple kind of two-part polyphony. This is to be explained by the fact that the Germans played the big violin with the non-relaxable bow. In quality, these suites remind us of the French. The last but one is described as suite discordable, and requires a tuning of the A string down to G, thus. For the last, Bach requires a stringed instrument with an E string above the A. There may have been 5-string cellos at that time. It is more probable, however, that Bach wrote the suite for the viola pomposa that he invented, and that was strung in this way. We know from Gerber, who was the son of one of Bach's pupils, that Bach employed this instrument in the orchestra in the early Leipzig years. The stiff way, says the lexicographer, in which the violoncello was played in Bach's time compelled him to invent, for the animated basses of his works, the so-called viola pomposa, which was a little longer and deeper than a viola, and was turned like a violoncello with a fifth string E, and was laid on the arm. On this convenient instrument very high and rapid passages were easier. In considering the works for a solo instrument with clavier, we must remember the distinction of that day between the obbligato clavier and the accompanying clavier. In a sonata with obbligato clavier, the latter plays the chief role, several obbligato parts being given to it, while the solo instrument has only one. In Bach we do not get a sonata for violin and clavier, or sonata for flute and clavier, but sonata for clavier and violin, and sonata for clavier and flute. A light is thrown on the way of looking at the matter in that epoch by the fact that a work for clavier and violin, if the polyphony was in 3 parts, was called a trio. They counted, that is to say, not the instruments, but the obbligato parts. By sonata for violin and clavier, Bach means a composition in which the clavier only supplies the bass and the figured bass. Even Zelter uses the terms in this sense. Of Bach's works for obbligato clavier and violin, we possess a suite in A major and 6 sonatas for violin with accompanying clavier. He wrote a sonata, a fugue, and 4 inventions. The suite for clavier and violin is not on the same level as the 6 sonatas. It is probably an earlier work. Bach incessantly improved the sonatas, as is shown by the various copies of them. The last version is represented by a copy of Altnicol's. The manuscript that belonged to Emmanuel is overloaded with ornaments. In the same way, Friedemann, when transcribing his father's organ sonatas, embellished them according to the taste of the epoch. This shows us how much reliance is to be placed on the ornaments in any work of Bach's that we possess only in copies, even though these are by his sons. These sonatas were written at Cothen. How small, by the side of them, seem the works of Corelli and the other Italian violin composers, at whose feet Bach had sat in Weimar. Bach's sonatas, like Beethoven's, depict soul states and inner experiences, but with force in the place of passion. Whether he is sunk in sorrow or in mystical dreams, Bach always recovers himself in a compact fugal finale. Sorrow predominates. We could almost imagine that Bach wrote these works under the impression of the loss of his first wife. The Siciliano of the 4th sonata is composed on a theme that closely resembles that of the aria Embarme dich in the St. Matthew Passion, and a sob runs through both of them. Siciliano from the 4th sonata. Aria Erbarme dich from the St. Matthew Passion. This movement has of course nothing in common with the Siciliano of earlier composers except its motion and its rhythm. It has nothing of the lyrical pastoral mood. It is filled with the deepest pathos throughout. It should be played in this spirit, the violin part, as in the corresponding aria in the St. Matthew Passion, being heavily rather than lightly accented. The 3rd and 6th quavers should be brought out with some force, and opposed by means of a certain weight of emphasis to the following strong beat. If Bach had not conceived it thus, he would not have aimed at greater intensity towards the end by throwing the accent back on to the weak beat by means of syncopation. Many of our violinists play these sonatas in a sentimental style instead of the expressive Bach style. An experienced critic in the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik rightly complains that in the practical edition of the new Bach Gesellschaft, the player will be misled into beginning the proud and energetic themes of the allegro movements in a soft piano in order to get the usual gradual crescendo, and will do this even in the theme of the last sonata. That this is intended to suggest impetuous motion is shewn by the fact that Bach uses it again, only in fuller form, in the secular cantata Weichet nur betrübte Schatten (BG 11), to illustrate the works Phoebus flies with swift horses. Of what use are all the pianos, mezzo fortes and fortes that the majority of our players and many editors import into these sonatas? The musician has yet to be born who can convince another where the piano or the forte or the crescendo or decrescendo should begin and end in the various movements. Of course, the obvious echo effects and the contrast intended between a pianoforte theme in one part and a tutti theme in another admit of no question. But what nuances are we to put, for example, into the first movement of the B minor sonata or that of the E major? Why should we play now softly, now loudly, in the andante of the first sonata? As this alternation is not an essential part of the structure of the works, its only effect must be to create an impression of aimlessness and unrest. What should we say if any one were to paint over fine, old steel engravings in modern tints under the pretext of heightening their effect? Yet there is no such general outcry against the variety of colors that are imposed upon Bach's works. In general, each movement of the violin sonatas should be played with a uniform stretch of tone. This does not mean that they are to be played monotonously. Declamatory nuances contained within the range of the general tone quality must bring out the detail in the same animated way as in the case of the pianoforte works. But from the architectonic standpoint, there should be no insistence in this music or variations of tint that will affect the broad, plastic lines of it. Our modern emotional dynamics would obliterate the plan of the work and give a false idea of the cooperation of the three obbligato voices. We should try to play these sonatas with an eye only to the animated and plastic working out of the detail, and to a kind of broad declamation, leaving the variety to come from the vivacious interplay of the parts. The direct impression the pieces make in this way will prove the rightness of the principle. As regards the tempo, the andante movements are as a rule taken rather too slowly, and the allegros much too fast. We seldom meet a player who plays, for example, the theme of the final allegro in the third sonata in such a way that the hearer receives the impression of proud strength that should be given by this sequence of intervals built up on a basis of moving semiquavers. Even the best performance, however, is not wholly satisfactory. This is the fault of our pianoforte, the dull timbre of which does not blend with that of the violin. It is hopeless to try to blend a modern grand piano and a stringed instrument. As Wagner says, the timbre of the piano and that of the violin are incompatible. In a Bach clavier sonata this is unpleasantly evident, for the composer has calculated on the cooperation of absolutely homogeneous obbligato parts. This was obtainable in his day, the cembalo producing the pure tone of a string vibrating on a wood resonance. It was only slightly brighter than that of the violin, owing to its coming from a metal string. When the cembalo part is played on a modern piano, the ensemble of the equal homogeneous parts is destroyed. We only hear a solo with pianoforte accompaniment. Even if in the future we should go back to a domestic instrument that substitutes a pure silvery timbre for the thick and brutal tone of our huge grands and uprights, the difficulties with regard to the performance of the sonatas for piano and violin would only be half surmounted. In the clavier parts of these works, Bach counts on the simultaneous doubling of a tone in several octaves, which is possible only on the cembalo. A good cembalo, like that of Friedemann's acquired by Count Voss, has 4 strings to each note, to give the ground tone, one the lower octave, and one the upper octave. According to the couplers he used, the player could strike simply the 2 ground-tone strings, or these and that of the upper octave, or all 4 together. The tone was small but very rich. In this respect our modern piano cannot compare for a moment with the sparkling, dashing cembalo. Moreover, the player could bring out the theme more pointedly by doubling it in the upper octave, or, if the theme was in the bass, in the lower octave. We can thus imagine how different the adagio of the first sonata, that of the third, and the largo of the fifth would sound then from what they do on a keyed instrument of today, on which it is impossible to play in 3 octaves at once. As a matter of fact, the adagio of the fifth sonata, with the double stopping in the violin and the arpeggio demi-semiquavers in the clavier, is positively unpleasant when performed nowadays. The necessary vaporousness and at the same time definiteness of the tone can never be got on our grand piano, and the double stopping in the violin is never quite beautiful, for it can only be properly done with a loosened bow. Only in this way can these 2 violin parts receive the delicate organ-like tone they need, with the silvery tone of the clavier playing round it. Nature, fortunately, is compassionate, and lets us believe that we hear music only with the ears, while in truth we take it in at the same time through the eyes, and correct our hearing accordingly. We enjoy these works because the eye's perception of the beauty of them on the paper, and the mind's conception of the noble counterpoint, permit the ear to believe that the work sounds well in performance, and the delusion continues even if both players indulge in senseless alterations of pianissimo and fortissimo. But any one who has the misfortune to hear only with the ears is bound to admit that Bach's sonatas for clavier and violin imperatively demand the cembalo. This was insisted upon by Rust in his preface to the original edition, 1860. He could not foresee that 40 years later the demand would be still more peremptory, and that an attempt would be made to meet it by the construction of the new cembali. We would not deprive those who have only a modern piano of their pleasure in these sonatas. Only we must be quite clear as to what an ideal performance of the works would sound like, and not seek this ideal in a false modernization of them. We must not omit to mention the tradition that in performing sonatas of this kind the cembalo bass was helped by a stringed instrument. We shall in fact find that a discreet violoncello does good service in these works of Bach, especially where the theme has to be brought out in the lowest voice. This can be tested, for example, in the largo of the F minor sonata. An old manuscript, partly autograph, of the sonatas categorically recommends the use of an optional gamba to strengthen the bass. It bears the title Sei suonate a cembalo certato e violino solo, col basso per viola da gamba, accompagnato se piace, composte da Johann Sebastian Bach. The chords to be struck between the obbligato voices are only rarely figured. They must be added, however, in every place where the contrapuntal web is thin, for example, when only the violin part and the bass are at work, or when the clavier alone is playing in 2 parts. If the movement begins with only a bass note, it goes without saying that the whole chord is to be struck, but in such a way as if it were being sounded by another clavier, not by the one that is playing the obbligato parts. In this discreet way, the harmonic basis of the whole can be indicated throughout, even when 3 or more voices are going together. But to handle the piano part in this way requires exceptional skill, and a knowledge of the peculiarities of Bach's figuring, otherwise the harmony will not be correctly filled in. Kirnberger appears to have employed 2 claviers when playing the sonatas, one playing the obbligato parts, the other strengthened the bass and supplied the harmonies. We also possess the following instrumental sonatas by Bach: 3 wonderful ones for clavier and gamba, BG 9, page 175, 3 for obbligato clavier and flute, BG 9, page 3, 3 for flute with clavier accompaniment, BG 43, page 3, 1 for 2 violins with clavier accompaniment, BG 9, page 231, 1 for 2 flutes with clavier accompaniment, BG 9, page 260, which Bach afterwards rewrote as the first sonata for clavier and gamba, though it sounds better for 2 flutes. The end of the first movement of the third sonata for clavier and flute, A minor, is lacking. Bach wrote it on the same sheet as one of the concertos for two claviers with orchestral accompaniment, employing in his usual economical way the three vacant staves at the bottom of each page. From 6 of these leaves the lower part has been cut away, so that we lack some 50 bars of the sonata. The autograph was already in this mutilated state when von Winterfeld brought it for a few groschen from an antiquary in Breslau. The sonata for flute, violin, and accompanying clavier G major is written for the violino discordato. Bach desires the player to tune the two upper strings in a lower tone. Thus, and consequently writes the part out a tone higher. As there is nothing in the violin part that could not equally be well played with the strings tuned in the ordinary way, Bach's purpose in prescribing the peculiar tuning can only have been to get a softer timbre that would blend better with that of the flute. Of Bach's orchestral works probably scarcely any have been lost. We possess 4 large suites and 6 concertos. It cannot be settled whether the suites were written in Cothen or in Leipzig. In any case, Bach performed them not only before the Prince of Cothen, but also in the Telemann Musical Society at Leipzig, which he conducted from 1729 to 1736. He calls these works overtures, not suites or partitas, this being the customary name at that time for an orchestral suite in which the introduction played the chief part. They are, however, just as much real partitas as those in the Klavierübung, except that the old dances, the Allemande, the Courante, and the Sarabande, retire in favor of the newer and freer movements. The introductions are monumental movements, all constructed on the plan of the French overture. They begin with a stately section. To this succeeds a long and brilliant allegro. At the end, the slow section returns. When Mendelssohn, in 1830, played to the old Goethe on the piano the overture of the first of the 2 suites in D major, the poet thought he saw a number of well-dressed people walking in stately fashion down a great staircase. In 1838, Mendelssohn succeeded in getting them performed by the orchestra at the Gewandhaus, Leipzig. It was the first performance of any of these splendid works since Bach's death. In the dance melodies of these suites, a fragment of a vanished world of grace and elegance has been preserved for us. They are the ideal musical picture of the Rococo period. Their charm resides in the perfection of their blending of strength and grace. The celebrated aria is found in the first D major overture. The 6 concertos are known as the Brandenburg, having been written for Margrave Christian Ludwig, 1677 to 1734. He was the youngest son of the great Electoral Prince by the latter's second marriage. He was passionately devoted to music and maintained an excellent orchestra. He made Bach's acquaintance about 1719, perhaps at the Meiningen court, with which he had relations through his sister, or perhaps in Karlsbad, where Bach accompanied Prince Leopold there. Enchanted by Bach's playing, he asked him to compose some works for his orchestra. Bach fulfilled this wish and sent him 2 years later the 6 concertos with the following dedication: À son Altesse Royale, Monseigneur Chrétien Louis Margrave de Brandenburg. Monseigneur, comme j'eus il y a un couple d'années le bonheur de me faire entendre à votre Altesse Royale, en vertu de ces ordres, et que je remarquai alors qu'elle prenait quelque plaisir au petit talent que le ciel m'a donné pour la musique, et qu'en prenant congé de votre Altesse Royale, elle voulut bien me faire l'honneur de me commander de lui envoyer quelques pièces de ma composition. J'ai donc, selon ces très gracieux ordres, pris la liberté de rendre de mes très humbles devoirs à votre Altesse Royale, par les présents concerts que j'ai accommodés à plusieurs instruments, la priant très humblement de ne vouloir pas juger leur imperfection à la rigueur du goût fin et délicat que tout le monde sait qu'elle a pour les pièces musicales, mais de tirer plutôt en bénigne considération le profond respect et la très humble obéissance que je tâche à lui témoigner par là. Pour le reste, monsieur, je suppliais très humblement votre Altesse Royale d'avoir la bonté de continuer ses bonnes grâces envers moi et d'être persuadé que je n'ai rien tant à cœur
que je pouvoir être employé en des occasions pour digner d'elle et de son service, moi qui suis avec une zèle sans pareil. Monseigneur, de votre Altesse royale, le très humble et très obéissant serviteur Johann Sebastian Bach. Cotton, 80 mars, mai 1721. To His Royal Highness, Monseigneur Chrétien Louis, Margrave of Brandenburg. Monseigneur, as I had the honor of playing before your Royal Highness a couple of years ago, and as I observed that you took some pleasure in the small talent that Heaven has given me for music, and in taking leave of your Royal Highness, you honored me with a command to send you some pieces of my composition. I now, according to your gracious orders, take the liberty of presenting my very humble respect to your Royal Highness, with the present concertos, which I have written for several instruments, humbly praying you not to judge their imperfection by the severity of the fine and delicate taste that every one knows you to have for music, but rather to consider benignly the profound respect and the very humble obedience to which they are meant to testify. For the rest, Monseigneur, I very humbly beg your Royal Highness to have the goodness to continue your good graces towards me, and to be convinced that I have nothing so much at heart as the wish to be employed in matters more worthy of you and your service, for with zeal unequalled, Monseigneur, I am your Royal Highness's most humble and most obedient servant, Johann Sebastian Bach, Cotton, 24th May 1721. How the prince received this gift, and how he rewarded Bach for it, we do not know. When he died, these concertos, together with the rest of his large musical collection, were inventoried and valued. They do not, however, figure in the inventory under the composer's name, like those of Vivaldi and other Italians, but are included in two lots, one containing 77 concertos by various writers, the other 100. Each of these concertos was valued at 4 groschen. Thus, in the year 1734, the 6 Brandenburg concertos were worth 24 groschen. At a later date, the autograph score which Bach had sent to the Margrave came into the possession of Kernberger, who left it to his pupil, Princess Amalie of Prussia. She bequeathed it to the library of Joachimsthal Gymnasium, whence it afterwards came to the Royal Library in Berlin. In elegance and cleanness, this autograph surpasses even the famous score of the St. Matthew Passion. The bar lines are drawn throughout with a ruler. In spite of all this care, the score contains an error. In the 11th bar of the 5th concerto, the semiquavers of the viola descend in fifths with those of the obbligato cembalo. It is interesting to see that the error is due to a correction made by Bach in the fair copy. He noticed, that is to say, that the viola in the original version, which we have in the orchestral parts that have been accidentally preserved, ascended in hidden octaves with the solo violin. He at once erased the sequence, which he had already written in the fair copy, and inserted in place of it the descending semiquavers, without observing that in this way he was falling out of the frying pan into the fire. This is presumably the passage referred to by Zelter in a passage on Mendelssohn in one of his letters to Goethe. In the score of a splendid concerto by Sebastian Bach, he says, "The lynx eye of my Felix, when he was 10 years old, detected 6 consecutive fifths, which I perhaps would never have discovered, as I do not bother about these things in large works, and the passage is in 6 parts." The Brandenburg concertos are the purest products of Bach's polyphonic style. Neither on the organ nor on the clavier could he have worked out the architecture of a movement with such vitality. The orchestra alone permits him absolute freedom in the leading and grouping of the obbligato voices. When we said in another connection that Bach's mode of expression is to be conceived as a plastic one, and deduced from this certain principles for performance, there was a danger of our being misunderstood, as if our object were to try to reintroduce the old stiff way of playing his music. But one has only to go through these scores, in which Bach has marked all the nuances with the utmost care, to realize that the plastic pursuit of the musical idea is not in the least formal, but alive from beginning to end. Bach takes up the ground idea of the old concerto, which develops the work out of the alternation of a larger body of tone, the tutti, and a smaller one, the concertino. Only with him the formal principle becomes a living one. It is not now a question merely of the alternation of the tutti and the concertino. The various tone groups interpenetrate and react on each other, separate from each other, unite again, and all with an incomprehensible artistic inevitability. The concerto is really the evolution and the vicissitudes of the theme. We really seem to see before us what the philosophy of all ages conceives as a fundamental mystery of things, that self-unfolding of the idea in which it creates its own opposite in order to overcome it, creates another, which again it overcomes, and so on until it finally returns to itself, having meanwhile traversed the whole of existence. We have the same impression of incomprehensible necessity and mysterious contentment when we pursue the theme of one of these concertos from its entry in the tutti, through its enigmatic struggle with its opposite, to the moment when it enters into possession of itself again in the final tutti. In Bach we often have not one but several groups of solo instruments that are played off against each other in the development of the movement. The wind instruments are used with the audacity of genius. In the first concerto Bach employs, besides the strings, a wind ensemble consisting of 2 horns, 3 oboes and bassoon. In the second, flute, oboe, trumpet and violin are used as a kind of solo quartet against the body of the strings. In the third he aims at no contrast of timbres, but employs 3-string trios, all constituted in the same way. In the fourth concerto the concertino consists of 1 violin and 2 flutes. In the fifth it consists of clavier, flute and violin. In the sixth Bach employs only the timbre effects to be had from the strings, 2 violas, 2 gambas and cello. The study of Bach's nuances in these works is a continual source of delight, for they are all so simple and yet so full and rich. Observe, for example, how in the first movement of the fourth concerto, from the 27th bar before the end, the piano comes down in a wavy line from top to bottom, following the line of the forte theme that winds downwards and lies, as it were, in violent convulsions on the ground, till suddenly a bold forte of the whole orchestra puts an end to the unrest that began with the first entry of this subsidiary theme in the violins, and leads into the victorious conclusion. Many conductors, indeed, are still of the opinions that Bach ought to be corrected here and there. They think that the nuances should not be sharply defined against each other, but should merge into each other by a crescendo or diminuendo. This, of course, quite destroys the terrace-like plan of Bach's music, to which Viana da Motta has called attention. There are also conductors who try to get a better effect by making a final tutti dribble out to a pianissimo. The same rules holds good for the tempo here as in the organ and clavier works. The better the playing, the slower the tempo can be, because when the hearer perceives all the expressive detail, a quite moderate tempo has the effect on him of a quick one, while in the faster tempo he could scarcely grasp the rich polyphony. Are the Brandenburg concertos suitable for our concert halls? No one can doubt this who has heard one of them, say under Steinbach, and observe the effect on the audience. These works should become popular possessions in the same sense as the Beethoven symphonies are. Spiro finally says, in a glowing article in which he affirms the right of the modern public to Bach's orchestral works, that these concertos in reality are not concertos but symphonies. It is to be hoped that the overtures will come into their own before long. Our instrumentalists would profit greatly by going to school to Bach. There are no insuperable difficulties in the way of performance. It is not for the best that the flute à bec in the fourth concerto should have to be replaced by our traverse flutes, but the total effect really does not suffer. Viola players who can also play the gamba will probably be found before long in nearly every orchestra, so that the sixth concerto may some day be freed from its Babylonian captivity. For the second concerto the instrument makers, Alexander Brothers of Mainz, have made a small F trumpet, on which it is possible for any good trumpeter, with a little practice, to play the original Bach part, so that for the future it will not be necessary to modify the part or give it to the clarinet. Mendelssohn had recourse to the latter device when he produced the first D major overture, and it is retained in David's edition of the work for the Gewandhaus concerts. The small Quartgeiger, giving the 4-feet tone, for which Bach writes in the first concerto, must also find cultivators again. Too large an orchestra is rather a disadvantage to these concertos, as it destroys the natural proportion between the solo instruments and the tutti. We are on the very border line between chamber music and orchestral music. The woodwind in the tutti must of course be increased in proportion to the strings. The accompanying clavier must not be omitted, even when the orchestra is a large one. In a small room a cembalo can be employed. In a large one it is best to have a good table piano, or a small Erard grand of the old style. A modern grand is too dull harmonically. For the concertizing piano, however, we should always employ a modern grand, as here it must play the part of a solo voice. The harmonies should be given on another piano. It is most desirable also that the basses in the tutti be accompanied in octaves by a piano, as this will bring them out more clearly than exaggerated emphasis in the double basses. It will always be noticed that to force the tone anywhere in these works is to spoil the effect. When once the Brandenburg concertos and the overtures have established themselves in the concert room, the question will arise as to how far some of the preludes to the cantatas can win the same rights of naturalization. It is already settled in principle by the fact that Bach himself does not hesitate to transfer movements from his overtures and concertos into his cantatas. He used the introduction to the first Brandenburg concerto as a sinfonia for the cantata Falsche Welt, Dir trau ich nicht, No. 52, and the first movement of the third concerto as a prelude to the cantata Ich liebe den Höchsten von ganzem Gemüte, No. 174. But as a piece for strings alone did not seem to him rich enough for the church, especially in a festal cantata on Whit Monday, he added in the latter case 3 obbligato oboes and 2 horns, without altering the original composition. This would be regarded as an astounding technical feat had he not eclipsed it by another. He made the splendid chorus of the Christmas cantata Unser Mund sei voll Lachens, No. 110, by simply adding vocal parts to the allegro of the second overture in D major, BG 31, page 66. One would almost suppose he had written the overture and the cantata together. The allegro theme of the overture is so characteristic a musical representation of laughter that it seems to have been prompted by the text of the cantata. A cantata prelude particularly fitted for performance as an independent orchestral piece in the wonderful orchestral mood picture from Am Abend aber Desselbigen Shabbats, No. 42, in which Bach paints the silence and the peace in which the slowly descending twilight envelops the earth. The arrangement of Bach's clavier and organ works for orchestra must be regarded as superfluous and imperfect, even when they are as sensitively done as Raff's arrangement of the G minor English suite. It is misleading to speak of Bach's clavier concertos and violin concertos, as these works have nothing in common with the modern concerto, in which the role of the orchestra is largely that of an accompanist. With Bach it is only a matter of giving a specially brilliant obbligato part to the solo instrument. If this happens to be the cembalo, it may also play the bass in order to employ both hands. That Bach thought in the first place of the obbligato part, and only secondarily of the instrument that was to play it, it is evident from the fact that the majority of the 7 clavier concertos are not primarily planned for the clavier. Almost all are arrangements, 6 probably come from violin concertos. Bach needed clavier concertos when he directed the Telemann Society. The arrangements are often made with quite incredible haste and carelessness. Either time was pressing, or he felt no interest in what he was doing. Violin effects to which he could easily have given a pianistic turn are not remodelled at all. Later on he improves them here and there in the score, but leaves them as they are in the clavier part. The reason for this was that he himself played the cembalo part, and did as he pleased with the notes before him, making a new part out of them. We are under no special obligation to incorporate these transcriptions in our concert programs. It is otherwise with the triple concerto for clavier, flute, and violin in A minor, which we are accustomed to regard as the Bach clavier concerto. No audience surely could help being carried away by this work even at a first hearing. It would certainly occupy the first place in the repertory of every earnest pianist, if the cooperation of the two other solo instruments and the whole style of the work did not demand more rehearsals than the majority of concert directors are in the habit of allowing to a piano concerto. As is well known, this concerto has grown out of the clavier prelude and fugue in A minor. On comparing the sketch with the masterly expansion of it, we seem to share the pride that Bach must have felt when he saw the new work arise in all its majesty out of the old. The middle movement is taken from the organ sonata in D minor. Of the three concertos for two claviers and orchestra, two, the first and the third, are arrangements of concertos for two violins. The original of the first in C minor no longer exists. The third, also in C minor, is identical with the D minor concerto for two violins. How Bach could venture to transfer the two cantabile violin parts in the largo of this work to the cembalo with its abrupt tone must be left to himself to answer. Had he not done it himself, we should be protesting in his name today against so un-Bach-like a transcription. This is not the only case in which he makes it hard for his prophets to go forth in his name against the evil transcribers. The one original concerto, however, number 2 in C major, compensates us for all our disappointed expectations in the two others, if we can speak of disappointment in connection with Bach. The fact that it was originally conceived for two claviers is shown at once not only by the rich writing for the two solo parts. In the third section of the splendid fugue they are in three parts throughout, but also by the subordinate position given to the orchestra. It is not an orchestral concerto with two soli cembali, but a concerto for two claviers with orchestral accompaniment. Perhaps, indeed, the first movement existed at one time without instrumental accompaniment. Certain indications go to show that this was added later, and that Bach wrote it out at first not in score but in parts. Otherwise we cannot explain how it happens that in two places of this first allegro, bar 83 and 108, the orchestra enters with the major third, while the clavier parts maintain the minor third, which grows logically out of what has gone before, and we do not make it major until the following crochet. Bach would certainly have noticed this error had he had the clavier and orchestral parts before him in the score. The curious thing is that the mistake was not noticed in performance and at once corrected in the clavier parts. An accompanying piano is not necessarily here, the two solo claviers themselves supplying the most essential harmonies. The cembalo accompagnato is here really the orchestra, consisting of a simple string quartet, which in reality only plays a figured bass that has a good deal of rhythmical interest. In a performance in a small room it can be quite well replaced by a third piano. An ordinarily good player could easily play the part direct from the orchestral score. We could even arrange for the two pianos all that is really indispensable in the orchestral accompaniment. The two concertos for three claviers, BG 31, are constructed on the principle that underlies the original works for two claviers. In them also the string quartet retires into the background. For the most part it only supplies the harmonies, and aims at supporting and throwing into relief the leading part in the ensemble of the three claviers. The second concerto, it is not agreed whether the original key is C major or D major, is planned on larger lines than the first D minor, and the orchestra plays a more important part in it. In the adagio there are even tutti passages in which the three claviers merely accompany the orchestra. The tonal and rhythmical effects that Bach has achieved with three claviers are indescribable. At every hearing of these works we stand amazed before the mystery of so incredible a power of invention and combination. An old tradition has it that Bach wrote these two concertos in order to play them with his two elder sons. If this be true, they must date from about 1730 to 1733. The concerto for four claviers, A minor, is based upon a Vivaldi concerto for four violins. Of the violin concertos we possess only the half, those left by Philipp Emanuel. Those belonging to Friedemann are probably lost forever. We have three concertos for violin and orchestra, A minor, E major, and G major, an important fragment of an allegro movement from a work for violin and large orchestra, D major, and a concerto for two violins with simple string orchestra, D minor. Of lost violin concertos, at least three, two for one violin and one for two violins, have come down to us in clavier arrangements. The concertos for violin and orchestra that have survived are among the works of Bach to which it is useless to employ the method of analysis. We must put them in the category for which Forkel briefly and eloquently observes, "One can never say enough of their beauty." The A minor and E major concertos are beginning to win a place in our concert halls. Modern audiences are enthralled by the two adagio movements in which the violin moves about over a basso ostinato. We involuntarily associate them with the idea of fate. The beauty of the A minor concerto is severe, that of the E major full of an unconquerable joy of life, that sings its song of triumph in the first and last movements. The concerto for two violins in D minor is perhaps more widely known still. It can be played at home, as its orchestral part can be easily transcribed for the piano. Every amateur should know the wonderful piece of the Largo man non tanto in F major. The concerto in E major was regularly given in the Berlin Singakademie even in Zelter's time. This Bach improver, for such he is shewn to be by his revision of the parts and the marks of expression he has added, thought it necessary to have more alternations of solo and tutti than Bach had indicated. Emmanuel seems to have performed this concerto in Hamburg, otherwise he would not have had the parts copied so carefully. Forkel has a notable passage to the effect that Bach had instrumental soli played during the communion, and wrote most of his own for this purpose. Of the violin concertos, however, he could have used only the Largo from the concerto for two violins. In modern performances of the two concertos for single violin, the orchestra is generally too large. This becomes unpleasantly noticeable when the basso ostinato in the middle movements is played in an intolerably heavy style by half a dozen contrabasses and twice as many cellos. The accompanying piano is usually omitted, without regard for the hearers who are conscious of gaps in the passages where only the violin and the bass are playing. Isaiah plays these concertos in captivating style, even though at times he modernizes them too much. But his habit of having the general bass performed on a harmonium is inexplicable either on historical or logical or musical grounds. End of chapter 17. Read for you by Chiquito Crasto. Music performed from the source text available in the public domain by Jonathan Schofield, Birmingham, Alabama.